I thought it was a great interview. I liked this woman immensely. What reminded me, Ankur, it reminded me so much of some of the dynamic with Richard Mendelbaum. I don't know if that means anything to you when I say that, but just her refusal, her outright refusal to be pinned down into anything binary. But she played ball with you. And I think you guys really ended up somewhere that was like a beautiful sort of resolution of that. And I just want to poke around in you for a little bit, if that's all right. I just wonder what that kind of where your thinking is, how it might have been shaped by that discussion. There's a couple things early on that I think are significant. And I just wonder, they're actually themes we've discussed before, but this idea of a yin yang kind of relationship with purpose. Let's just use purpose for the focus here, because that's what you guys were discussing. Mm-hmm. So she was relating to this sort of articulating the purpose in a way that is defined and then pursuing that as essentially a masculine trait, right? Mm-hmm. And that then there's more of an intuitive approach to, like, say, when she's creating a piece of art just from kind of an abstract notion of something she wants to convey as feminine. How does that model sit with you? You didn't push back on it at all in the interview. And I wonder if those kind of primal masculine and feminine energies, for lack of a better word, are relevant to you at all.
Yeah. So I'm having a vision, like an image coming to my mind of a painting of Shiva.
Yeah.
Hindu god, for those of you who haven't met him. Nice, but can be a little chaotic sometimes. So many of these Hindu gods have a masculine and feminine aspect. And so Shiva, he has a feminine aspect named Shakti. And often they're referred to as one, Shiva Shakti. Or same with Krishna, there's like Radha Krishna. They're referred to as a unit. And in these paintings that I've seen of them, what always strikes me, whether it's Krishna or Shiva or one of the other ones, they look so androgynous. And I think part of that aesthetic is calling us to this idea that if we want to have this kind of binary thinking about the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine that humans have had for so long, and I don't actually have a strong take on how relevant it is to us now. I mean, I kind of do. I think there's like a fundamental relevance to that. I don't think we need to be stuck on it. But the idea of having that, breaking that into those two sides, is so we can integrate and have the best of both. And when I see these paintings of Shiva and Krishna, it's just like, wow, they really have the best of both. They have like all of the like kind of classical strength and power of the masculinity with like all of the like beauty and health and cleanliness of the feminine. And it's all like very clearly integrated. And so if we're going to be making these distinctions, I think they are with the intention or in service of uniting them so we get to have the best of both worlds. And so when it comes down to purpose, it's always like, I talk about this with people almost every day because I guess I'm just obsessed with it. But the idea is that, yeah, if we just let it flow and let it just, it's just like, whatever, let it hang, I'm going to do what feels right. We end up, there's places you can't get, places that involve the very deepest, most powerful expression of who you are that we can't get without effort and intention. And similarly, if we do it through this very like intentional, analytical, I'm going to make my 25-year plan and then I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, there's places that we can't get that are about the full potential and expression of who we are because we're not tuning in to this moment and we're not tuning into what it means to be me in this moment.
Yeah, that's beautifully phrased, on both sides of that. But just from the first point you were making, one thing I could relate that to is training something, like physically, like working out. And there's moments in that exertion where you can't really trust yourself except by holding yourself to something you've set ahead of time, either an interval or a number of reps, or you know that it's past your limit and you know that you're going to go through something where you're going to want to quit. But having those constraints set, having thought about that ahead of time is exactly what you say. You can't necessarily trust yourself to squeeze that last like 5% out, to give it your all, because your sense of your all in that moment is really affected by your mindset and kind of what you're going through, what's coming up. And then on the other side, I encounter this all the time with our clients too, where the reaction to what they're interpreting as something so reductive as to be almost formulaic is to just reject it or to just kind of pay it lip service. Like, okay, I got my purpose now. And this thing that you're talking about sounds like Edie might be a great representation of one of these androgynous gods, because it's the way she's unfolding that for you in the conversation is so dynamic. Even it's not necessarily first I do this and then I occupy the feminine for a while. It's really dynamic. She's really sensitive to kind of both entry points. Maybe that's another way to say it. Like we can enter, we're getting to the thing. We have these different tools or these different ways of getting to it. But her fundamental orientation of that is so creative. It's so dynamic. Maybe that's kind of a secret to her success in that way of staying so creative and productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And what I really love about it too is it's really highlighting the inquiry and the importance of the process of inquiry and how we each do it. We each do it differently, and that's good. It should be, because I have people on the show who, you might be like, oh, they've figured it out, and let's see what it looks like for someone who's figured it out. But I feel like Edie is really like championing. We're always in the process of figuring it out. And she has this okayness with that, this acceptance, because that's fundamentally, how could it be any other way? Anything else is just a total illusion. Like, oh yeah, I wrote my purpose statement. Now I'm chill. Like, yeah, like so this ever unfolding mystery, and she's not letting that escape, right?
Yeah, I mean, something about that I think is so native to the arts, but it's applicable everywhere. I'm thinking of someone that's designing a product, for instance, and doing kind of the deep thinking and development of like that product work. But of course, like we know, you release something, people start engaging with it, they use it, and it totally transforms what you thought it was or meant or does, or the value that it provides. Even saying the same thing, essentially, and I think this is maybe just, like I say, it's kind of native to the arts where you create something, you put it up on a wall, and that loop is closed then in the subjective experience of the person interacting with the art. You can't really control that, right? So when you ask her, is there something you want a piece of art to do? It's like, well, yeah, I mean, I had an idea, but, I'm not in the room, and it would be absurd to like think you would stand there in a gallery waiting for people to come up to the painting and then like kind of directing their experience with it, right? Sort of defeats the purpose of like having this intimacy with a piece of art.
Yeah. That story about was it a Christmas market where the person looks at the card and just has this powerful experience?
Yeah. But she couldn't have predicted that, right? I mean, if she kind of gone this masculine, quote unquote, or this kind of reductive path, that wouldn't have been part of it. And because she left this sort of open-endedness to it, this openness to allow that process to complete in the experience of the observer. Wow, that seems like something that could be so powerful for anyone kind of doing this high level work.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So in this theme of kind of bringing it back to our friend Nate, anything come out of that for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it definitely, it kind of agitated me a little bit. So it's interesting, Ankur, because, and maybe this is something you could help me psychoanalyze about myself. So many of the exercises I've extracted from your conversations and experiments that I'm writing from kind of the desire mapping, which produced this wonderful project I'm engaged in all quarter with movement and shaking and dancing in the morning, which I love. Quick update, incredible experience doing that. So I would say, again, something in here is Edie pointing me back to my creativity and inviting me into some of these undefined realms where I would need some help though, thinking about how to structure that, right? Because kind of by definition, it's unstructured. But when Edie sits down, she has a medium, right? She's working with. So do I, we have like all these creative outlets. For instance, this podcast, there's stuff that we're working on right now that's creative in nature. And I wonder what it would be like to actually begin with this sense of what I want someone to feel and bake in this open-endedness, not be so kind of constrained to, I need this person to do this or respond to it in this way. Is that making sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. Let me see if I can figure it out. So one way of sitting down. So I know you have a lot of tasks And I do get the sense sometimes that you're overwhelmed with the number of tasks you have. And that's in the air around this too. So maybe you sit down, you look at your like whiteboard and you're like, all right, write a blog post. That's the next task. Or maybe it's film an ad or something like that. Or maybe it's even something about the podcast. But you're kind of saying, instead of the actual task or maybe the actual kind of business action that the task is meant to create, to start with this feeling of like, how do I want them to feel? And so rather than like, I want to write 500 words in this blog post right now, it's just like, here's the feeling I'm trying to inhabit myself, or the feeling I'm trying to create. What's a way I can do that in the next hour? And maybe it ends up being writing, but maybe it ends up being you're filming yourself doing like acting exercises, or, there's this, we have space for so much multimedia creativity that if you're like, I'm trying to provide value to a group of people, maybe it's the public, maybe it's my clients, like whatever. Everything I do creatively could potentially be valuable. How am I going to use this time to create this experience?
Yeah, that actually reminds me of someone we've been working with this quarter, one of our clients who's set up this experiment where it's just a 90-minute block.
Mm-hmm.
And he hasn't decided ahead of time what that's going to be. He takes this moment at the front of that block and then kind of feels in to what's needed.
Yeah.
That feels pretty plug and play. I feel like I'm give him credit for it, but it seems like pretty plug and play for this experiment. You're saying essentially, I have, X to the N sort of tasks to do. And it really does feel like that, just becomes so exponential sometimes. But to just lock off a period where I know I'm going to be creative. I know that I'm going to create something. I haven't decided ahead of time, but I did create that structure around my time to know that, if it's blocked off, there is some output, but maybe I've baked in some of this opening that Edie's talking about.
Yeah. And I think that would be the integration. Because if you totally just follow like, I'm just going to do what I feel in this 90 minutes, you might just like end up having another bowl of breakfast or watching TV or whatever. But if you're like I'm going to create whatever output feels right. You still have this kind of the more like masculine, as you're calling it, stride of like, there's actually something.
I'm not calling that. Don't.
Because you're just so into this masculine stuff, man. I mean, I'm trying to deal with it, but it's just like, you're just so into it.
I don't have a feeling one way or the other, but it's the way you framed it. And I think, it's like you said, there's a historical relevance, and it does help us sort of kind of think about it in these polarities or opposites. But yeah, I agree. There's obviously kind of social aspects that are problematic, and I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion about that, but I do think it's helpful for this conversation, especially the way you framed it in kind of the Shiva Shakti way.
Yeah, and it really ties into kind of what we started with Edie in the beginning. Can I bring up another aspect of this masculinity thing that I'd like to talk to you about?
Sure.
So we went on we were together. We were in person. We beat the whole notions of space and time and distributed workplaces, and we were hanging out, and you educated me about this men's work ritual that I found very, very beautiful and very, very helpful to address some of the parts of what it is to be a man. And I was just wondering if there's any aspect of that you feel comfortable sharing. And if not, we can not use this part at all.
Yeah, I'd be happy to just talk a little bit. I think context and the set and the setting of all that's important, but just a little bit of context, I'd have to credit Alonso Del Rio, a gentleman that is a wonderful teacher, an activist, a musician. And he wrote a book that I helped him translate called The Four Altars. And it's his synthesis of a system based on ancient traditions and teachings. And these kind of basic forces, these energies of kind of, you called it sacred masculine or the sacred feminine. We don't even need to go that metaphysical. I think basically the assumption is if you're a human being, you had a mother and you had a father, and those habits of attachment that you developed with them early on are very influential in how you approach your life. And what we did on our hike was to spend some time going through each one of these altars or kind of stations and just acknowledging, first acknowledging my father, Salvador Ramos, and everything he is, and his father and his father's father, really just connecting to that. and acknowledging it and honoring it for all of its problems, all of its trauma, all of the kind of violence that exists in my personal family line. And then you move on to the mother and you do the same thing with the mother. And then kind of the rest of that journey is an integration of those two fundamental energies within you, right? And what I really like about it is it makes it concrete and it connects it to your formative years with your caregivers. So it's not so much about gender. It's not so much about that per se, or our classic notions of masculine, but really like how we connect. And some of us don't have a relationship maybe with one caregiver. But that is a relationship, right? And it's something we address, in that work, and that we did address.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so thank you for doing that. And the whole thing was very new to me. I was like dipping my toes in this part of the world that I didn't know. And I found it really valuable. And one of the things I loved about it as a guide, or kind of a structure to guide a couple of people going on a hike, is that it really ensures that you end up talking about all of the really important things. Because you could see an old friend or a new friend and spend like an hour or 2 hours or 4 hours with them and end up just talking about bullshit the whole time, about the weather, or just like the textures of your job, or things that are fine to talk about. But by doing this ritual, you basically ensure that you're going to talk about the most core aspects of what made you who you are and what continues to affect your day-to-day experience of life. It's like inescapable, given all the things that you cover. You talk about fear, you talk about shame, you talk about your spouse, you talk about your partner, you talk about your parents. It's like all the things that could potentially cause you, or are causing us, tension or distress or fulfillment, are all covered. Which, as a guy who loves connecting deeply, it's like, it kind of guarantees me that I'm not missing any opportunities to connect deeply with the person I'm with.
You said that so much better than I did. So maybe you could splice it together so you just answer your own question. But that's wonderful. Maybe a detail to say that was just kind of unique about the way that day unfolded for us is that, like, as an example, on the way up the mountain, I kind of demonstrated the process, and we got to the top of the mountain. That was Mount Baldy in the Olympic range, right? Maybe we could put a picture in the show notes of what a gorgeous place on earth that is. And that's, of course, right where you live. It's your literally your backyard. And so, I think I turned to you at the top of the mountain and said, hey, I can verify these work. And maybe it's a good idea that you do it on the way back down. And so the uniqueness of that journey, I would say that's kind of also a feature of this tool, is it's solid enough, like what you're saying, to kind of guarantee a structure and a presence throughout that process. And it's flexible enough to sort of fit the demands of the moment. Yeah, I would just recommend it if people wanted to follow up on this. The book is called The Four Altars by Alonso Del Rio.
Yeah, fantastic. And maybe, would you be willing to be interviewed on this podcast about it and have that be like a whole episode?
Sure. Yeah. Probably better if I flew down to Peru and interviewed Alonso, but maybe in the meantime, we do that. Thank you. A great conversation. And thank you, Edie. And thank you all for listening. Can't tell you how much it means to us to have you giving us and allowing us your attention for these episodes. Thank you for listening. Thank you for asking questions, and thank you for reaching out and getting in touch with us. And we hope you do that, continue to do that, to find any of those outlets, to contact us, info@10kh.show. Great place to get a hold of us. And anywhere you find this, we'd love to hear from you. You can also find the SpeakPipe link in our show notes. That's really a cool thing, because then we can hear your voice, which we love. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.
That concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes Show. Thanks again for listening. And I hope that this has contributed in some small way to your own personal journey of heroism. I'd like to give a shout out to Pierre for the episode artwork, DJ Plainview for the theme music, and to our producer-editor, Martine. This podcast is sponsored by Momentum Lab, our year-long coaching program providing insight, accountability, a community of excellence, and one-on-one support. I encourage anyone who's intrigued to go to whatismomentumlab.com and explore. Finally, I love communication. If this episode has impacted your life in any way, let me know. Our email is info@10kh.show, And there's other ways to contact us in the show notes. Thank you. Have a wonderful day and take care.